Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today we're going to be talking about best practices for using data. And a few of you are definitely familiar faces from prior webinars. And so you've heard me talk about data. What we wanted to do, since we knew this was such a topic of interest and on everybody's mind right now, we wanted to bring in an expert. So beyond New Jersey, more at the higher level, we wanted to bring in Dr. Grant Smith. So today our focus is going to be, I'm going to spend some time asking him some pertinent questions, and we'd absolutely love to have your questions as well. So as we move forward, please feel free to put your questions in the chat, or at the end we'll definitely have an opportunity for a Q&A. So welcome everyone, and welcome Dr. Smith.
Thanks, Michelle.
I think what we'll do first is I'd love to have Dr. Smith give us a little bit of his background. I have his bio here, but obviously it's tiny print and I'd rather hear it from him. So Dr. Smith, if you wouldn't mind just giving us a little bit about your background, how you got involved in data science and what you love about it, what interests you, working with administrators.
Sure, I'd be delighted. So I'm currently in my 10th year as an associate professor of measurement and statistics, but my background actually goes back quite a bit farther than that. I wish that I were that young, but regrettably I'm not. So I studied education and mathematics as an undergraduate and was a high school mathematics teacher for about 3 years, which I really enjoyed, but I was ambitious, I was young, I was single, and was going to school at night and receiving business training. So I obtained a master's degree in business and went into the private sector, transitioned from that. And in the private sector, I worked in operations management, which was pretty much looking at the efficiency of manufacturing and how we could do things. And it became a great source of interest to me to understand how decisions were made. And that expanded itself to trying to understand how decisions were made in all sectors, not just in manufacturing, but also education and whatnot. And as I began to press on this question, I learned that many decisions were made because that's the way we've always done things, or decisions were made because somebody at the top, because of their position, was assumed to have more knowledge, when in fact there was no evidence substantiating the decision. There was no evidence substantiating decisions for the way we always did things. So I thought there must be a more objective way that I can go about understanding how decisions are made. So I elected to go back to graduate school and study statistics. And in working with that, most of my applications of my research were actually in education. While my work was in statistics and measurement, much of my work was in education. And I had the opportunity to work on a federally funded program, which was an effort to bring the tools of data collection and improvement into education. So I was able to do that for a number of years. And after going back and forth as a consultant and doing things, I made the transition back to higher education through work at the Center for Educational Research at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where I worked on the mathematic quality of teaching initiative for a number of years. So my transition to statistics has been in and out, or my transition into education has been in and out between public education, the private sector, and higher ed. But what I really love about being back in education is taking some of the tools and some of the lessons that have broad applicability across multiple sectors and finding out how they can be used to improve education. And part of my work in my current faculty position is working with those who are seeking administrative credentials to become principals. So not a great deal of my work, but I do get to teach a course to those individuals each summer on the utilization of data, evaluating data and utilizing data. And it's been a great source of pleasure to me to work with these individuals to see how they can utilize data in a more scientific framework in their approach to improvement, whether the improvement is in student outcomes, whether the improvement is in attendance rates or parental participation or whatever objective they're seeking. So that's kind of a long way to it, but that's a short version of my background.
Well, I appreciate that you did that instead of me reading this. I appreciate that. We can see the depth of your experience and how it applies specifically what we do. And I know that the administrators that are here today, probably something that probably resonated with them in terms of what resonated with me, it's probably similar, is that you said that we want to make decisions not just because that's the way it's always been done. Right. And I see Miss Douglas Brown shaking her head. It's something that I think we wrestle with in education. And so my first question to you, and I'm just going to kind of pop up some images for us to look at and think about, is, in education, how should we approach data? Because there can be so much of it, it can be overwhelming, it can cause anxiety, but yet we know it's so important. So there's sort of that double-edged sword. So if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about what should our approach be in the field of education to data?
Sure, I'd be delighted, and I'm overjoyed to see the quote from Edward Deming, who is one of my mentors, who also said, without data, all we have is opinion. He also said that convention is the greatest barrier to improvement. Conventions and traditions are the greatest barrier to improvement, which points to how we always did things. So I think data has kind of gotten a bit of a black eye among educators to some extent. And I think before we get to how to effectively use data, I think it's important to call out and shine a light on some of the reservations that lead to some of the anxiety and some of the perhaps misuses of data in the past, so that we can just kind of clear the air about this, because measurement and testing and assessments, they've all kind of gotten a black eye. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. The first reason that before we can utilize data effectively, we have to recognize the limitations of data and how data can be used effectively and how data can be used ineffectively. And one of the most ineffective uses of data is to utilize measures for punitive purposes rather than improvement purposes. And educators have become very, very susceptible to criticism in the utilization of data for punitive and critical reasoning. So I think that utilizing data exclusively for punitive or sanctioning reasons, or grading, so to speak, comparing one school to another, is not necessarily the most effective way to get folks to embrace data in the use of their work. And complicating this use of data is the misuse of data from a content validity perspective. Oftentimes, the data that are being used or being fed back to school level administrators and classroom teachers lacks content validity, meaning it's based perhaps on an end of year assessment, which doesn't really align with the standards or the objectives that students are being taught. Right. So suddenly schools and teachers are being held accountable for outcomes that deviate from standards. So there's a misalignment periodically between what the standards are and what the standardized measures are. And that doesn't mean standardized measures are bad. And I hate to vilify measurement, because it's a critically important part of this, but we always have to make sure that we have content validity. So one of the critical uses of data, we'll get to evaluating the content validity of data. Other reasons for reservation is data often lack utility, meaning you get the data back from someone. It comes through this magic process and it's delivered to your email box, and suddenly you have these metrics and you say, what the heck do I do with this? I don't even understand this. I don't know how to read it. It doesn't seem to have any practical utilitarian value to what my job is going to be today, tomorrow, and the next day. So we want to make sure that if we're manipulating or working with data, that we're using it from a utilitarian perspective, that we're clear on how we're going to use it. And then finally, one of the other great limitations on the use of data where it has been misused, creating some sense of anxiety, is there's been quite a bit of overreach. And that is that student performance, student achievement, teaching a child to read is a tremendously complex process. And if we utilize one single assessment that we use at the end of the year, or perhaps two assessments, one at the midterm and one at the end of the year, and we determine that this student is reading at levels beyond target or beyond proficiency, and that's strictly the result of poor instruction or poor teaching. We really grossly reduce and oversimplify the challenge of teaching. And this has created kind of a black eye for data. So keeping in mind that data is limited, I think that getting back to your question, how do we use this data? First, we have to recognize the limits on data. We have this large amount of data that comes in. Usually when we receive data back, it's like drinking from a fire hose. You want to just get a sip, you just want to find out what's useful for you, and you're overwhelmed with this data. So don't be intimidated by that. You know, we just have to be able to decipher that which is immediately applicable and has utility for us, and that which maybe doesn't now, but may down the road. So you don't have to use everything you get. Just use that which you can consume immediately. The second thing is, let's not elevate data to a position of importance that it doesn't deserve. Obviously, as a statistician, I love data, but data is just evidence of something. It's not a truth. Just because it's a number doesn't mean it's the absolute truth in the representation of a student's ability or the absentee rate or whatever your data happens to be. It's just a piece of evidence. What adds evidence to the value is the user's profound knowledge. So you all, once you understand how to utilize the data you receive, can use that much more effectively than I could, for instance, because you have profound knowledge of educational operations and what's involved in your job. So data should just be a part of the evidence that helps you make good decisions. It's not the answer and it's not the truth. It's one component that you utilize in conjunction with your profound knowledge, with your experience, and with anecdotal evidence that you have on your own to make good decisions. So as former classroom teachers or current classroom teachers, I'm sure none of you would take one single test score and decide that that was a completely comprehensive descriptive of that child's ability or potential.
Right.
You would obviously utilize your profound knowledge. It's no different. Data is enriched by your knowledge. It's just one piece of the puzzle to help you make good decisions. Data is it's not exact, it's probabilistic, which means that it has some error associated with it. There's a difference between measures and numbers. So you're getting measures back when you get data, you're not getting numbers. They don't have the exactness of a mathematics class. That number represents a measure which has error in it. Obviously, if you look at a number, if you're looking, for instance, at a spelling score, the percentage of words spelled correctly, that's going to be one score, one slice in time. It's a measure. It's not an exact replication of that ability. So it's limited there. And the thing to keep in mind with data is it's just one part of a much more complex picture. It's your knowledge and your use of it that makes data valuable. So with all those limitations.
So it really just thinking about one couple of things that you said, and I think I can connect the dots here for our attendees. We just finished what's called the New Jersey Start Strong, right? And so this was really a snapshot in time. In fact, the tests or the assessments, I should say, were quite small, quite a small sample size. And so I think that's really helpful for everybody attending to see it as exactly that, as just that snapshot in time to kind of give us a focus, right? Give us some evidence of where we are and kind of help narrow our focus for right now, right? So we use some of that data. Our last webinar looked at the various types of data that schools were receiving: student level, grade level, class level. And so what will help us right now make those instructional decisions? That makes sense. That sum up kind of what,
It absolutely does. And in all likelihood, in my experience, I hate to say this, probably none of it, as it is going to help you make direct instructional decisions. This is where you're going to have to use your profound knowledge. And as we talk a little bit more today, some other tools will come out that we can discuss that show you how to utilize that. But absolutely. So there's always going to be a transitory step between what we would call reactive data or retrospective data that we received on what a student has done and how to effectively utilize that moving forward. There's some transitions that have to occur there to get the most efficiency out of the data.
Okay.
So there is some good news about all this. All these
Right.
limitations we discussed, all the anxiety, is that data has a tremendous potential for improvement. As a matter of fact, it's an absolutely necessary component of all improvement efforts. Whether you're trying to increase your heart rate, whether you're trying to make 10,000 steps a day, whether you're trying to increase your students' performance, whether you're trying to increase your sense of engagement or interest among your faculty or among your parents, it's all measured and evaluated utilizing data. Now, it's
Right.
not always a strict questionnaire or observation type tool instrument. Sometimes it's your own observations. But whether you realize it or not, you are filing these things away as evidence that you're making decisions with. So everything we do in life is driven by measurement and by data. When we get up in the morning, we check the weather, we do things, we look at our fuel tanks, we look at our bank accounts. We're surrounded by these indicators of where we are at any particular point in time as it applies to where we're trying to get to. So the utilization of data is not alien, it's very natural. It only becomes alien when we're told we have to utilize data and we have to suddenly think about it. And we're like, uh-oh, now I have to use data,
Right.
but you do it all the time. So we can start data anytime. This is an interesting period in education because we're in the midst of this weird in and out of school
Right.
limitations and whatnot. So this is a great time to start intentionally thinking about how you can collect data and utilize the data that's available to you. So we mentioned it's imperative to improvement, but the other thing that makes data kind of fun to use and give you some sense of security is that there's a kind of a silly saying among statisticians. We're not the most humorous bunch, so you have to take what you can get. But there's a saying that says, uh, in God we trust, and everyone else must have data. And what that essentially means is that if you have if you have data on 10 of your students and you show the measures over time where they're working towards a particular objective, and you're in a faculty meeting, for instance, and somebody says, well, I think my students do this. And somebody else says, well, I think my students, it's not that that information isn't valuable, but when you then say, well, I can show you what 10 of my students have done, which informs my thinking. What's
Right.
informing your thinking? Your informing thinking. So data is this objective means by which we can gather evidence that gives us greater insight into the phenomenon of interest, as well as greater confidence in our decision making. Because it's not just us, it's this objective source of evidence that we're utilizing to make decisions. So because it does that, sometimes the utilization of data really clarifies ambiguity. It can
Right.
reduce subjectivity, help us make more informed decisions, and allow us to make decisions utilizing evidence that is transparent, that everybody in the group from a collaborative effort can look at together. So,
Right.
yeah.
Okay. What came to mind there, and I don't know if anybody have questions about this, is oftentimes when we're in PLC meetings and faculty meetings and we start talking about student performance, we'll get a little bit of pushback where teachers say, well, you can't compare my classroom to so-and-so's classroom. They feel very much that they're being compared as a person, as the teacher. But what we're really looking at is those instructional decisions, right? What instructional choices are being made, for example, in the 5 third grade classes that are in my school building. So to your point, I think when we have the opportunity to share that data at a PLC meeting, at a faculty meeting, and we can look at that, it's less about the person and more about the instructional decisions that are causing this data, or not causing, but impacting the data that we see. Is that sort of what
Absolutely, Michelle, that's
you think?
spot on, because I think the reaction, particularly among teachers, because they seem to be dispositionally more sensitive to their role in the learning process. And there's a lot of research that shows the importance of a teacher in a student's learning. But let's be reasonable. There's lots of other things that impact a student's learning too. It's not just the teacher. It's the method the teacher uses. It's the time of day. It's the supplementary materials. All of these things could be adding variability or differences to their student outcomes. So when teachers say, I don't think you can compare your class to my class, that's not what we're doing. We're trying to look at, how are you doing things? What materials are you using? Are you using group instruction? Are you using individual instruction? Are you using this program, that program? What are the other sources of decisions and things that are within your control that are impacting student outcomes? And let's talk about this and find out what are the most effective practices for us.
Okay, so I just got a question from Miss Thompson Dixon. She says, I also believe sometimes teachers want to use subjective data such as attendance or poverty or behavior. How do those factors weigh in, and should they, I guess, and is it subjective, or can we bring in, like, if we had hard data on attendance, is that something to consider, or how do you find those other factors that she just raised?
So this is a great question, and it's really, really important. And it points to the importance of collaborative work among a group of educators. And what I mean by that is simply this, is that when we look at student outcomes, and let's just assume we're talking about student outcomes with the data exclusively, although there are other outcomes we could look at. We're looking at student outcomes. If we look at that and we say, okay, this is what our student outcomes are. This particular school has a higher degree of free and reduced lunch or a greater impoverished group. This particular school, excuse me, has lower parental involvement. We know all these things that can affect student outcomes, and we don't want to diminish the importance of them. But what data allows you to do is to prioritize your strategies such that you can get the biggest bang for your effort, so to speak. So if we know that instructional method is contributing to differences in our student scores, instructional methodology is completely within the control of a classroom and a school. What's not within control of that school is the poverty rate. There's nothing we can do about the poverty rate with our students. So that's one that we acknowledge has an impact, but let's focus on the things that we have more proximal influence over initially, get those to where they're operating optimally, and then we'll work on these things that are more distal to our ability to control. So that's okay. Always my suggestion regarding that.
Okay. And I know we'll probably touch on this later, so I'm just going to put it out there. If we can address that idea of that the measure typically is going to relate to the standard, right? Then all that data is telling us is we need to do either more work or different work around that standard, right? And so if I have students that are coming in, the way I think about it, I'm a special ed teacher. If I have students that are coming in and their readiness or their prerequisite skills won't allow them to achieve that standard, then what am I doing to help build that prerequisite skill to get them ready for that standard? So we don't want to throw up our hands and say, oh, these students are just so far behind. We do want to look at that very specific standard and prerequisite skill and how I can break it down or scaffold it to support their growth around that.
Which can't be done without data, interestingly enough. So to start with the student, you have to understand where they're living, and really the way to do that objectively is to get some measures, and ideally we'd have multiple measures. In addition to a standardized test, we might have a teacher recommendation, we may have some observational measures, we may have some a record of some teacher-made measures over the course in some sort of portfolio. All of this can give us a more objective idea of where a student's starting point is, and clearly, if they're not going to meet a standard because we're working from a constructionist perspective and there's prerequisite learning that has to occur, we're all wasting our time skipping ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so for our second question, I know this was a big one. A few people asked it last time, is how do we, this whole idea of best practices to use data, things like, our objectives, the standards, but what are ways that we can be systematic about it? And what are those best practices? And I threw this up there because, and it kind of reflects back, us as administrators going to those PLC meetings or to those faculty meetings, just posting that data up on the board probably isn't going to do a whole heck of a lot. But how can we kind of communicate to our team these best practices and ways that we can be systematic and use it to our advantage?
So just like instructional methodology and just like curriculum materials and whatnot, there are evidence-based practices for the use of data also, and that's what we want to be cognizant of. And the first thing that we want to always be very, very cognizant of is evaluating the quality of this data. And quality comes in two forms. Most important is the rigor of the data, meaning are the data, which essentially constitute evidence of something, is it good evidence or is it poor evidence? In other words, early we talked about a lack of content validity, meaning is the evidence we're receiving back in terms of student performance data or student test data, is it inconsistent with what they were being taught?
Right.
Does the test meet the standards? Because if there's an inconsistency there, before you go any further, you have to stop and say, which train do we want to get on? Do we want to revise our teaching to match the content that is being featured in the test? And teaching to the test is kind of a loaded term. I don't necessarily mean that, but assuming the test is measuring something of value, right, then we say, well, yeah, we are teaching to the test because the test is measuring this. So we have to determine if there's validity there. So there always has to be objectives or standards or some sense that matches the data that we're looking at. And then the goal for data improvement, the best use of data in an organization such as a school would be to collaboratively evaluate it. And what that means is having somebody lead and say, what is going to be our goal? What is our collaborative goal for the use of this? And I think one of the big challenges in utilizing data is folks try to take on too much too soon. Get the low-hanging fruit first. Look through the data, find the obvious opportunities for improvement, come together as a group and figure out how you're going to attack the problem is kind of problematic language, how you're going to address this challenge in a way that's most efficacious in order to produce the result you want. And that's usually done better through collaboration.
Right.
So go ahead.
No, go ahead, keep going.
Yeah, so collaboration. So really what we're trying to do when we come together and look at data for best practices, what we're looking for is variability. That's the key to everything that we're seeking. What makes data informative and useful for us is when we see differences among our students.
Okay. So that idea of variability is those differences help us make a decision about what to do next.
Right. So the next question is, what could be causing these differences? Right. Once you see the differences, then as a group, you can discuss what can be causing these. And we're kind of getting a little bit into the next thing we'll talk about, but there are specific tools that you can utilize to examine those differences. There's affinity diagrams, and there's this thing called a cause and effect or an Ishikawa diagram, which can be used collaboratively, perhaps the first time with a facilitator, but then they're very simple tools to use that can be used there. And this helps you generate hypotheses or potential reasons to explain why we're seeing a wide range of difference in reading scores among our kids or in math scores or whatever the measures are. And then using the profound knowledge of the group, this is where the anecdotal information and the experience becomes very important. You can say, well, I think part of the problem might be because we're not spending enough instructional time on this particular skill. Somebody else might say, well, I think my kids are tired after lunch, and that's typically when I teach this particular subject. So you can generate these potential causes for what's explaining the variability. So stop thinking about what your average score is. Start thinking about the differences in your scores and what can potentially explain that. Because if you can explain the differences, then you can maximize or optimize the methods or the materials or the amount of time spent or the temperature in the room, the various things that can contribute to this. group work versus individual work, seat work
Right.
versus project work, all these different things, then you can maximize your efforts to investigate those scientifically on how they might impact the outcome. And if you do it collaboratively as a group, it becomes very interesting. So if you look at your scores together, say, this is what we want to work at, we prioritize that, then let's go and design the work to improve this. So what you've done is you've taken retrospective data and you've designed proactive improvement efforts utilizing data. That's the first step.
Okay.
And the second step is, let's say we've decided we want to try increasing our instructional time in a particular skill among the first grade classrooms to try and explain or increase these reading outcomes. Then you want to figure out how you're going to do that. And then that takes another level of investigation. What are the best practices? And you want to use evidence-based practices here, you know, whether you're looking at the What Works Clearinghouse data, or whether you're looking at Hattie's book to find various interventions and effect sizes. Ideally, you would use an evidence-based approach to this and figure out how you're going to measure this. You know, what are the various outcomes you can do and how frequently you're going to measure this. And if you'll do that, you can construct a proactive improvement plan that is completely data driven. So that was an awful lot to answer what should be a pretty simple question, and forgive me for that.
No, that's okay. I want to, and if anyone has questions, please feel free to put it in chat. So you just said that last piece. So you're asking, what am I going to do? And then how will I measure it? So you're going to be now measuring the intervention you put in place.
That's it, because
Right.
you know, if you get a score on a kid's reading comprehension or math outcomes, it doesn't really tell you why the reading comprehension varies. It doesn't really tell you why student performance varies on a particular math standard. So it's up to those with the greatest knowledge, which is the teachers and the administrators. That's the important thing to keep in mind. Nobody has more knowledge about these particular groups of student learning than the teachers and the administrators working with them. So it's up to them to say, okay, what do we want to focus on in order to produce a better outcome here? And what are the potential reasons for the low outcomes? And then once you do that, you can say, well, let's put in an intervention where we increase the instructional time and let's monitor their performance periodically. And this is another part of the utilization of data that's widely overlooked. And that's the educators do an awful lot of formative assessment, but more often than not, it's very informal. It's not approached in a very intentional way. And to really measure the efficacy of an intervention or an improvement effort that you're putting forth, you should be a little more intentional in looking at that data. That's why the collaborative work helps. Because if you can put the performance and compare and share your performance with one another, you can see whether you're having an impact or not. And what that would mean is moving from a biannual weather forecast, where we go out on January 1st and say, what's the weather? And we determine that's what the weather's going to be like, or that's what the weather was like for the past 6 months, and doing it again on June, which is kind of like educational measurement, also called post-mortem measurement, where oftentimes our end of the year scores tell us what our patients were suffering from, not how they could be helped. So we want to be a little more proactive. So when you introduce these interventions, set up formative measures. Doesn't have to be fancy, doesn't have to be really sophisticated, but it should be frequent enough such that you can detect changes, which might be daily, it might be weekly, it might be bi-weekly, whatever it is, and monitor that performance. And now what has happened is you have taken control of your data. The data no longer controls you. You have taken control of the data because you're doing periodic measurement, which should be directly linked to the outcomes on the summative data that you're receiving in terms of these reports.
And I could see how teachers could feel that there's a lot more buy-in at that point if they were invited into the discussion on the first hand to kind of brainstorm what the potential causes could be. But also, to your point, well, if I'm going to try this intervention, let's make sure that I'm doing something to check in to make sure it's actually working. And that my time is being spent well, or that the right intervention is being given to students. And so I love that you'd said earlier at some point, like data, it could be fun. I grabbed this picture from a PLC meeting that teachers were having, and I love that they really did control their own data. They developed, based on the standards, they made sure that the test and even those little formative questions, like you mentioned, are they actually testing what they should be testing or assessing what they should be assessing, right? So a lot of times it's drilling back down into the standard and saying, oh, my question only really addressed this part of the standard, but not this second part. And so I think it can be something that teachers can really have a lot more buy-in and feel good about if they have some collaboration or some partnership in creating these proactive pieces.
And I agree. It should be a fun. It should be a fun exercise. I mean, when you join a collaborative to improve your health, whether it's to lose weight or to improve your cardiovascular fitness or whatnot, it's always much more effective when it's working in a collaborative environment. And you're doing periodic check-ins and you're sharing with one another, sharing your struggles, sharing your successes, because this isn't about measuring teachers.
Right.
It's about measuring the outcomes that the entire system is set up to produce. And when I say the entire system, teachers and schools and administrators are a part of that, but they're not the entire system. So you're only going to move the needle so much. And I think one of the challenges that educators face is they're trying to be too heroic in their efforts. And what I mean by that is an incremental improvement in education is worth celebrating, because our achievement has been flat for so long. We're not going to go from 0 to 60. And you know what? No one really does. Sometimes it seems like there are overnight successes in our lives.
Right.
What you do is you discount the 10 years of work that went in before they became an overnight success. So what we're really seeking is incremental improvement, which means you're not going to fix everything on the first go around. Pick something that is of a high priority and of
Right.
interest. So you're not going to fix math, science, and all the reading skills simultaneously. So you have to collaborate, come together as a faculty. I think this is my opinion
Right.
on how it should be used. Come together as a faculty, prioritize what it is you're going to work on for the next semester, and then work on it diligently and intentionally. And again, it should be fun, because this isn't about somebody doing poorly or doing a bad job, because you're going to collaborate and agree upon what the intervention is, what the data you're going to collect are, share and monitor your progress. And again, it really should be a cause for celebration and fun.
Right. So this isn't something I thought about until right now, but what's your thoughts about sharing data with students, right? Because if we're saying let's celebrate incremental success, wouldn't that be something we'd really want to do, is share that with them?
Yeah, absolutely. So ironically, 100 years ago, when I was a doctoral student, I did a dissertation that sounds quite intimidating, but it was really quite simple. It was the asymptotic relative efficiency of a binomial estimator. But what that really was was a school that was based here in Florida. It was an alternative school where students were sent when they had behavioral or adjustment challenges in a typical school. So it wasn't necessarily when students created discipline issues. It was when students were either suffering from a lack of engagement, high truancy, or they just seemed to be completely disengaged with the content. They were sent to the school, which was one of the first self-paced schools. It was almost like a virtual school before we had the technology for virtual teaching. And one of the things that they believed in, the theory of action, was that prior to learning can occur, engagement has to happen. So the teachers in these schools would delve out their assignments and they would monitor the engagement just through observation. They would look at the observed engagement, which of course is a rough estimator, but it's there. And they would monitor that the student was on task or off task. And that's the data they were collecting. So for a semester, we looked at that data together and we saw quite a bit of variability. And then we thought, what if we allowed the students to keep their own charts, so that periodically a little buzzer would go off in the classroom, or a little ding would go off, and they would monitor whether they were on task or off
Right.
task. And there was a tremendous increase, not in the on and off task behavior, because obviously you're going to see that if the students are reporting their own, but when the teachers continued to monitor along with the students the task behavior, the teachers' observations of students on task behavior increased significantly, a large increase, when the students were also simultaneously monitoring their behavior. So the theory behind a lot of this is put the data in the hands of those that are in the position to do the most with it. And obviously
Right.
that's our students, then our teachers, then our administrators, and even the parents. If you can get
Right.
parents involved in the data collection effort, it's a great, it's a great incentive. So a great question. And there's lots of research that says if we can get the students involved in data collection and analysis, it's huge.
And we're going to have to switch in a moment over to like a Q&A and we'll start wrapping up, but just something that might resonate with the administrators here is when we were looking at the Start Strong data, for example, last webinar, I gave a sample of what one of the school's data looked like. And one of the things that jumped out to me, and I've seen this in practice with students, is the partially correct. Right? So there's the, I got it correct, I got it incorrect, and then there's the partially correct. And for me, you talked earlier about low-hanging fruit. I like to bring that data to students' attention and get them really excited about the fact that, like, look, you're almost there. You got some of this correct. And so much of the newer standardized testing, high stakes tests, asks kids to choose two or more of the best pieces of evidence, or two examples, let's say, of this particular math concept. And I think it is empowering for students to know, I get there's like lots of opportunities here for me to show what I know. Right. So I think that's an example of, at least I think that's an example of giving kids the power and giving them a little bit of insight where they can start to say, oh, okay, well, I'm going to take a stab at this. I might not know, I might not be 100% sure, but I'm going to take a stab at this because I have the opportunity to show what I know in different ways and maybe earn points for it.
Well, I think you're spot on. If you can get the students engaged in understanding their performance from a data perspective, which is a fancy way of saying get them excited about measuring and monitoring, or monitoring the measurement of their performance, and they can see their own opportunities. It's amazing how powerful data and data collection are, and particularly with this generation of kids with their social media and their utilization of phone. My kids, which are older now, but when they were younger, we're constantly doing these self-assessments of, which actor are you most like, or which Disney character.
Right.
This is nothing but measuring and monitoring things that
Right.
have meaning for you. If we can increase their involvement and their control on their performance through measuring, I think it unleashes many kids to really, really perform and take control of their own learning to a large extent.
Right.
We've seen that in lots of
And
research.
it's really our goal as educators, right, to have empower kids to take control of their learning. So I know we've all seen that. Before we move on to the Q&A, just what comes to mind is, for us, our role over at Inspired is we've partnered with many of you. We've been creating all of our products, all of the work that we do is based on what the feedback that you give us. And so what I was thinking about as Dr. Smith was talking was, we've tried to help schools after this year and a half of really interrupted instruction. We've tried to help them look at their data and then provide a very customized, sort of targeted, small areas of focus, to your point. So is that the most effective way that we can support, or the kinds of supports that schools will benefit from, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yeah, I think there might be one more step where your help could potentially be very beneficial to students, to schools, and that's to perhaps facilitate that first collaboration among the group where they're looking at it as a unit. But absolutely helping them identify the key areas from the data. Again, data is great, but like so much in education, we're asking teachers and administrators to do more. We're not taking anything away. We're saying, it's another unfunded mandate that you're going to now use this. You're not giving anything else. You're just supposed to do this on top. And given the large amount of data that's available on each student and each classroom and whatnot, I think that they do need some help in effectively working through that until they get a system in place. So I think that there's a tremendous opportunity here for improvement through more effective use of data at the school level. But I think that there's going to need to be some help to make that transition fully to utilize that data and identifying the key takeaways, limits how much time they have to spend in data analysis to begin to effectively use it. So I think the tools that you're talking about could be tremendously helpful for a school. Yeah, absolutely.
And you know, I love when you said that piece about, you know, we're being asked to do more, right? I saw in preparation for this, I saw a quote that said, don't see this as putting more on my plate, see it as having the right things on my plate. And I think that's our approach with it, is trying to be very practical and try to set teachers up for success in, you know, having a narrow focus, giving them the tools to measure it so that they can celebrate the successes. But with that, enough of me talking. I'd love to open it up to the group. If things came up or if you came with questions, I'd love to have you share those now. Either you can feel free to unmute or you can put them in chat and I'll read them out to Dr. Smith. You know, what resonated with you? What came to mind? What do you still have questions about? Even if it's specific to your school, I think that's okay. You know, any real life examples always help, you know, put things into focus. Okay, so in chat, Miss Thompson-Dixon, when sharing the data and posting it in the class, you should not include the student's name, but some sort of ID number. Absolutely. I mean, I think, Dr. Smith, you can speak to this, but you talked about students charting their own data. That certainly kids can have, you know, a folder or something like that. But when we're posting it, we obviously want to keep it confidential.
Yeah, I would even be a little reluctant to post individual student outcomes in a comparative system on a public display. I think you can look at like class outcomes, and so the whole class can be moving in aggregate as an incentive for that. And if they're working with their individual data, I think that, you know, we certainly don't want to hurt anybody's feelings or call anyone out in this regard. You know, they do that enough to teachers with this data. We don't want to do it with the students. But I think this is a great point, to be very sensitive to the use that the data could be potentially embarrassing if you can link it back to an individual student. Yeah.
Right. So if they have some sort of portfolio or folder or something where they're tracking, then that's something that they only have eyes on, as opposed to a bulletin board or something like that.
But it would be nice to put the class aggregate performance up to track. And I think many teachers do this. I've seen classrooms where they have charts where they're monitoring this.
Right. Okay. Other thoughts, questions? Thank you, Ms. Thompson-Dixon, for asking. Anything else that comes to mind as you were listening, or something we didn't address? Please feel free. We will probably end today and things will come to mind. So what I like to do, and what I will do, is I'm going to put for you in the chat. Please interrupt me if your question comes to mind. I'm going to put in the chat for you a follow-up survey form. And what I like about that is, in addition to you giving us feedback, you can post additional questions. So if things come to mind after this is over today, don't hesitate. Ms. Douglas Brown asked, or is sharing data at times doesn't correlate to the pacing of what's being taught in the curriculum. I think that's a really good point. And I don't know, Dr. Smith, if this relates back to what you were saying about when we're generating kind of the probable causes of why things, I think that's one that we have to consider. We didn't cover that standard yet. right? Or we didn't get to spend enough time on this yet. If you want to comment on that at all.
So I think this is critically important. And the challenge is in looking at this, when this occurs, when there's an inconsistency between the students taking a standardized measure and where we are, for instance, on the trajectory of the class or the curriculum, we can't take that personally. We have to recognize that, okay, here's the reason for that gap. Now, if this gap poses serious threats to the student's ultimate performance, then we need to address it. If, on the other hand, these students are at a particular point because you want to assure that they hit a certain level of mastery from a constructivist perspective before they move on to that standard, then that's a perfectly acceptable explanation for why there's an inconsistency between this outside scoring and your inside monitoring of progress. And it just, you recognize that, okay, there's ignorance regarding this standard. Ignorance for educators is job security, because it means there's a fertile field there that's yet to be planted. So that's a good thing. And in another nice way, it kind of gives you a benchmark. Say, okay, here's where they were before I taught the standard. When they retake this test at another time and they go above that standard, I get some idea on what I hit. So yeah, the thing about data is you can't take it personally.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an important piece. And it shouldn't also make us angry or upset or like go to directly, I hate these tests. What I try to, say to teachers all the time is, we don't teach to the test, we teach to the standards. The test measures the standards, right? But it is telling about, what else we need to do. So like I mentioned earlier about maybe we haven't taught to all parts of a particular standard. I know with math, when you open up the standards, you look, there's multiple sub steps to all of these. So it might just help bring us back to the standards and say, okay, maybe kids are doing really, really well on one part, but not another. So I think it's information, right? You pointed out earlier, it's evidence. It's not the truth.
It's not a value judgment and it's not truth. It's just information and evidence to help us make informed decisions about how to improve.
Right. Other thoughts or questions? This is great. I really appreciate you sharing your own insights and takeaways or things that you deal with on a day-to-day. Okay, so we have another thought Kim shared. I'm struggling with new students coming in well below benchmark, and we need to assess them at their time of entry, but it's difficult to find out where they are and where they should be a few months into the school year. Yeah, I mean, that's very tricky. I don't know if you want to speak to that specifically, that topic.
Sure. So what I really encourage here, and many of my colleagues would scoff at my suggestion, but the utilization of curriculum-based teacher measures to monitor student performance is critical to me as a professional. So what I would suggest there is, again, these don't have to be sophisticated, but what I call are leading indicators. We see all kinds of leading indicators in the news of how the economy is going to perform a year from now and whatnot. And these are based on quick little snapshots, frequent small samples that are taken of a process, outcome, or a performance to kind of figure out where they are. So if you have information on a student when they enter and you're having a difficult time trying to get a feel for where they are as they move through the progress, I would just strongly suggest introducing some curriculum-based measures that are associated with the standards, but have a great deal of utility to you as the instructor, as the administrator, to monitor a student's progress. And ultimately, if you find out that they're helpful for you, they may be even more helpful to put in the student's hands. And they monitor their own progress and they submit a weekly summary to you or a monthly summary, however that goes. So I think don't develop an over dependence on fancy standardized measures. And those are very important, and they're usually very critically robust, but utilize your own insights, your own curriculum-based measures to monitor student performance on a periodic basis would be my suggestion. I hope that addresses what she's mentioning.
And the other thing that came to mind too is, if this child is well below the grade level that they are in, that they are placed in. We can still address those things through, if your school does RTI, response to intervention, if there are, you know, this child might qualify more for that third tier, right? They might, that general best practice, universal screening piece, you know, we might know, okay, let's just move them to tier 3. There's no reason to do 6 weeks of them in tier 1 and 6 weeks of them in tier 2. And then just the general idea of differentiating, right? So they might not be able to master, or they weren't able to master something on this benchmark, but can I differentiate the standard in a way that that student can have some success and make some progress? So I think of those two things being really key, and especially now, after this 1.5 years of interrupted instruction, differentiation is going to be, it's going to be the rule, not the exception, or at least it should be. Okay. Other thoughts or questions? That was great. Thanks, Kim. Okay, I added into chat our survey link. I would love if everybody shared, fill that out and shared it with me, because additional questions you might have after today, I'd be happy to answer, to ask Dr. Smith, to follow up with you. But I think that this is going to be, I think we're all kind of in it together. When we talked about collaboration, we're all going to be kind of muddling through in the beginning of this year. I hope we're going to start to see the light at the end of the tunnel. But I think that the good thing is, after today, my takeaway from today, hopefully some of yours, is to be excited about data, to see it as something that we can collaborate on and celebrate, and can help really guide our work and our decisions. And that's really a good thing. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Smith. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. As I mentioned, I am recording this, so if any of your colleagues could not attend, I'd be happy to share it with them. Just have them reach out. And let me put this in again. Ms. Thompson-Nixon said she did not see the survey link. Can you see the survey link now in the chat? Okay.
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for attending, everybody. Again, I'll hang out for a couple minutes in case anyone has questions, and keep coming back. We'd love to have you at our next webinar. And yes, I can share the recording with you, Ms. Douglas Brown. Thank you again, Dr. Smith. Appreciate it so much that you took the time today.
It's my pleasure. Good luck to all of you. You know, we're all depending on you. I'm depending on you in my retirement years to get these kids through. So thank you for everything you do, and good luck. See you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Smith.
Have a great day, everybody.
You too. Thanks.
You too.
Thanks for your questions, Ms. Thompson-Dixon. Have a great day. Bye.